Yeah. Welcome everybody to this workshop, Nation and its Fault Lines, keynote speech by Professor Ananya Kabir. We are a little late and delayed, and we apologize for that, but I think it's always a good thing to anticipate and grow in anticipation for the keynote speech. So I'll introduce Professor Kabir. Ananya Jahanara Kabir is Professor of English Literature, the Department of English, King's College London, and winner of India's Emphasis Prize for the Humanities, and of the Humboldt Research Prize from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Germany, 2019. She's the author of Territory of Desire, representing the Valley of Kashmir from 2009, and Partitions Post-Amnesias, 1947, 1971, and Modern South Asia, published in 2013. She's currently writing a monograph, Allegro Politics, Creolizing Connection on the Afro-Modern Dance Floor. She works on creolization as a historical process and cultural theory. In May 2020, Ari Gauthier and Ananya Kabir co-founded the cultural platform Late Night Creole, through which they promote their vision of a multilingual, plural, and creolized India. And we would have that Late Night Creole first time live from Sweden with Ari Gauthier and Ananya Kabir shortly later. Welcome, Professor Kabir.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amrita. Thank you, everyone who's here. And really, we are all so excited to be able to convene in person again. And I hope that I remember how to do this. It's been at least a couple of years since we've had to migrate onto Zoom. So anyway, it is lovely to be here and feel everyone's energy. We've had some excellent papers in the morning, and a couple of them were on Kashmir. And so I'm kind of just pushing forward with that trajectory of thinking about Kashmir as this particular space crisscrossed by fault lines, to use the reigning metaphor of the workshop. But we also, of course, had some very interesting papers earlier on other fault line crisscross spaces, mirror images of Bengalis in West Pakistan and Urdu-speaking people in erstwhile East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. So I think we have really that matrix, is of identity and memory and struggling to find a subjectivity for oneself, but refracted through a live conflict zone, which is the space, the Kashmir Valley, in which I've done my research in the past, on which I wrote my book, and to which I've never been able to not go back, despite lots of other things that I've been doing since the book was published. One of the issues that keep haunting me, and I never quite stop asking a question about, is this key question of how is time itself experienced in Kashmir? Because for any of us who've been to a conflict zone like the Valley of Kashmir is, I think it strikes us. We are so naive when we enter the space. We enter thinking, oh, people are going to be conflicted, they're going to be traumatized, they're going to be living through the everyday in a particular way. And you go there and you see that people are not just living, they're actively doing things. They're sending children to school, they're getting married, they're thinking about their parents, they're thinking about finances, everything, the car, the garden, whatever, the next menu for evening, these are very confusing signifiers for many of us, because we go there expecting, I don't know what, but we realize that a certain quotidian reality gives people a backbone to kind of move through the day, to experience and actually occupy time too in a particular way. Because what is actually under conflict is also temporality itself. How is time experienced? So in other words, this question, this memory of how I saw people living in Kashmir when I used to go there for my field visits has never left me, and has remained a question to think with. And the more I think with it, the more I realize it's a question of layered temporalities, sacred temporalities, quotidian temporalities, the time of conflict, the time of resisting conflict, the time of thinking about yourself, for example, as a sexualized person, as a person with needs and desires, issues that are never really even often talked about at all in the space. In a conflict zone, even less, because people often feel it's perhaps more urgent to talk about other things rather than individual desires and needs. So all those questions come together in my talk today, which is pretty much about the question, how is time experienced in a conflict zone? And can this experience be harnessed by creative producers to articulate some kind of a project of resistance and even a hope for autonomy? Autonomy on all levels, political, cultural, and individual. And we're really happy because we have one such cultural producer here with us, Asya Zaru. And Asya has spoken in the morning, but I'm taking advantage of her presence here to speak a bit about her work. And also, she's here. We can have a discussion afterwards about it. So one of the works of Asya's that I will start talking about is this film of 2018, right? You created it in 2018. It's a very short film. It's a film of 7.49 minutes. We will watch it as a group together, I hope, afterwards. But I have a few things I'm saying about it, which will help people understand a bit about what the film is like, including, of course, those who are going to be watching this later as a recorded artifact. Uploaded on the web. So this film of Asya's is called The Stitch, and it's I was watching it at the same time that I was rewatching another film on Kashmir, which is Haider, Vishal Bhardwaj's film, which is a Hamlet, a Bollywood Kashmiri Hamlet, where the Hamlet figure is called Haider. And this film has been analyzed and talked about a lot. And I actually think it's a very interesting film, not least because it uses the Kashmiri-ness of Bashar Pir, the writer of Curfew Night. He is the person who wrote the screenplay. So, there's obviously quite a lot of Kashmiri input in this film, which makes it a bit different from the ordinary Bollywood reduction of various tropes and stereotypes into the space of Kashmir. Now, I was watching Haider for something else to write an essay on Haider, and then at the same time, I was watching Asya's film. So there's a kind of counterpointing of these two films in my mind. And one of the places where I think there's a definite connection is this leitmotif of a red muffler, which the Ophelia figure in Haider, Arshia, she's the girlfriend of Haider, she's knitting this red muffler, and she keeps knitting it, and it keeps it's kind of in process. And we know even from the figure of Penelope, in Greek myth, this idea of women who are weaving or creating textiles while they are waiting. It's a very common trope again. So there's all sorts of layers there. But we notice this is a gendered act. There's something being told to us by this red muffler, which keeps appearing at key points in the film. But then what happens is, so who is she knitting this for? In the film Haider, Arshia is knitting this red wool muffler for her father, who is basically ends up being a collaborator. And it's a complicated story, but he's responsible ultimately for the kind of destruction of happiness, and also he is the villain figure to counterpoint to the protagonist Haider. And so this muffler then actually, which is meant for the father, is used ultimately to bind the hands of Arshia's lover Haider. And then the muffler is abandoned outside a home, which was once very beautiful, this quintessential Kashmiri home of Haider and his family. And that home is burnt out because of the conflict. So this muffler really comes at these key moments. And ultimately the muffler, which is being knitted, unravels completely. And it unravels, as does the life of Arshia, this woman who is the figure of promise and sexuality and healthy desire for Haider. So this disintegrating trail actually leads me to a very different cinematic outcome for what we might think of as a resistive temporality, which is materialized through female creativity, because it is female creativity that is symbolized in this red muffler. And there's also a question of time, because when you're knitting or you're creating something, you're spilling in time. And the same issues are picked up in The Stitch, which is Asya's film. And in its 7.49 minutes, this film, The Stitch, communicates an alternative response to daily life, confined and menaced by barbed wire and gunfire. Deploying these signifiers of Indian occupation, Asya's camera interrupts its own task of immersing the viewer in the sights and sounds of Kashmiri nature. So when you see this film, we hear bird song, we hear the river water, we see the mountain, we even hear the squelch of mud, and I'll return to that in a second. But we hear all these sights and sounds of Kashmiri nature, and these sights and sounds constitute the world of a young female protagonist of this film. And she is a schoolgirl, and the stitch concerns a tear in her headscarf. So the girl wears a headscarf. It's part of a school uniform, and she's going to school, and it catches on barbed wire and tears. And then she stitches it together very clumsily. And in this way, immediately, I think Asya brings us to visualization and experience of how conflict ruptures existence on the level of the body, of this schoolgirl's body, even as the schoolgirl is growing into a certain awareness of femininity and its public presentation, because she is attached to her headscarf, and she's not happy that it's got torn, and she doesn't want to go around with a torn headscarf. So what then happens is very interesting. There is an opportunity for a young protagonist to enter an art competition whose prize money equals the price of a new headscarf. I have got that right, haven't I, Asya? So, but because this is Kashmir, there's curfew, and there's curfew time always in Kashmir. So this curfew temporality comes in, and because of curfew, she can't make it on time for that competition. And as a result, she can't get a new headscarf, at least in the 7.9 minutes of the film. So even as her sketches, so this girl is also a little artist, and her sketches, she's sketching the mountain landscape, and they flutter to the ground. And even as that's happening, she transposes the stitch of her headscarf onto a self-portrait. We'll see all this when we ultimately see the film. But then she starts shading that self-portrait with really intensely focused strokes, and you can really see and hear the crayon on the paper. And so she's kind of covering up a cover-up. And this is transmitting coming of age of this young girl through the realization of what it means to wait during a curfew without end. But that can only be surmounted by this other time, the urgency of the pencil stroke. And that pencil stroke is making creativity the kind of salvation for this girl, and also the solution to her problem of living through this curfew time. So the fierce energy of this girl that Asya manages to capture through what is called in cinematic terms a haptic focus, a close-up focus on the feet, which steps carefully through mud. And I told you that mud was important. So we have the camera going to the feet of this girl. It's squelching through mud very carefully. It goes up across stairs. It goes across boulders. And so through this camera's very close-up view, we feel the body of this girl learning to navigate this world around her on her own terms. And so she is taking agency. She's seizing agency through a sensuous awareness of her growing pubescent female body in space. And this too is a reoccupation of time, because in 7.49 minutes, we're really dilating time. You know, time is like stopping when we see all this so close up. This is the art of the haptic camera. And so what we really find is that urgency itself is getting modulated, and there's a slowness that's initiated by the woman as a creator of art. And it is Asya's cinematographic and philosophical answer, I think, to some conundrums that you also present in your anthology of poetry, which is here with us. A lot of us have copies of this book, and Asya also read from it in the morning. This anthology is called Serpents Under My Veil, and it was 2019, I think, right? So, you know, just a little bit after, quite close in production time to the film. And so, for example, there is in this, I will read out a poem here. There are many poems that we can dwell on, and I will keep coming back to the poems. But the poem I want to dialogue, I want to put my description of Stitch in dialogue with here, is a poem called The Insomniac Almond Tree Speaks. Blooms bringing your promise stink like dank weeds. Horseflies circle my head. Women bypass me on their way to the psychiatrist hospital further up the hill. Petals fall from almond trees, they sing, spreading madness all around. I'm assuming that these English quotes are a translation of a Kashmiri folk song, maybe. Asya, am I right? Again, something like that. Yeah. So the women are singing about almond trees and petals, but the tree is speaking and saying, I can't breathe. It's all drizzly and damp. Ring the gardener, please. Tell him to plow the soil over my feet. Tell him I'm sick. I can't sway. My roots cling to the fading scent of spring's past. Why keep me waiting so long? Please don't let me regress. Didn't I tell you my wounds will rust if exposed for long to air? Dear gardener, I hope you will return soon. I'll match my memory against yours. I stayed awake all this while to shelter the story of your blossoms. So this kind of a poem about an insomniac tree, which can neither sleep nor breathe, which aligns itself to the women who are on their way to the psychiatric hospital, because the tree is also sick. It's sick of waiting for spring to come. It's afraid of regressing to a future where its wounds will rust. And this is a kind of intervention within linear time that Deepthi Mishri, we work with a lot, our colleague, she has called the crypt time of Kashmir, a kind of clandestine, queer, and stolen time. And this crypt intervention within linear time ends, however, with an address of hope that the gardener, please come soon. Because the tree says, I stayed awake all this while to shelter the story of your blossoms. So there's some sort of like, I've played my part. You come and help me. Let's do this together. So some kind of a closing observation that brings together the voice of the tree and the poet. So by ventriloquizing the insomniac tree, Asya reminds us of a female Kashmiri contribution in ensuring community resilience during the infinite prolongation of conflict. But no, this is only one poem. This is one poem which tells you about this tree and the story of the blossoms, which she surrogates. And this poem sits alongside other poems. For example, the poem to the daughter yet to be conceived, which we heard in the morning, to childlessness, to the rejection of feminine, youthful beauty, to poems about lovers' trysts, to poems about aimless loitering. This is this anthology, Serpents Under My Veil, which joins Asya's lyrical film, Stitch, to carve a program of self-love and self-care out of the box of regulated heteronormative activity. That is, if you want to be happy, you don't have to necessarily just go and look for your lover under the chinar tree. That can work, why not? But it's more like before you go there, I have to look after myself. And that, I think, is the message that I get from reading Asya's work. And I think that therefore it represents a Kashmiri woman's creative response to a very prolonged, very layered, and very messy conflict. And one of the ways in which this creative response works is by setting up a dialogue between this response, your response, Asya, and some very well-known signifiers of Kashmir's natural beauty that congeal in a kind of set of tropes which are to do with gardens and gardeners and birds, so horticultural tropes, which are very deeply embedded in the Kashmiri imagination. And I'm going to ask Asya to read out for us a very key poem, well, not all of the poem because it's very long, but a few key quatrains of a key poem by Majur, who is one of the most important modernist poets of Kashmir, writing in Koshur, in Kashmiri. And the poem is called Volo Ho Bagwano. Yes, please.
Thank you, Ananya, for engaging with my work so deeply as I wanted to be engaged with. And it's a pleasure to read this for you. This is from Mahjur's longish poem, but we just do the two stanzas. Wala ho bagwana no baharuk shan paida kar, holan gul gat karan bulbul tithi saman paida kar. Come, O gardener, create the glory of the spring. The flowers will bloom and the birds will circle around you. Create such haunts. Karikus bulbula azad pinchris manz sanalan chuk. Panne dast pannan mushkilan asan paida kar. Who are you waiting, dear bird, to set you free? Forge with your own hands the instruments of your freedom.
Thank you, Asya.
Pleasure.
This is a really important poem. I discovered it, or my friends in Kashmir directed me to it when I first started going there for my research. And Mahjoor, I learned about Mahjoor and his position in a very long and, shall we say, even noble lineage of Kashmiri writing in Kashmiri. Not something that many of us know about at all outside of Kashmir. And Mahjoor is a modern poet, he's a modernist poet. Yet this modernist poet uses a very interesting legacy of Persianate images to do with gardens and gardening. And it's very, it's part of this whole Mughal also understanding of Kashmir as a garden and the building of Mughal gardens in Kashmir, and even Kashmiri products like the shawls we are wearing. Asya, you didn't wear your nice shawl today, but there is floral embroidery. I mean, this floral horticultural visualization of what Kashmiri culture, Kashmiri aesthetics is a very intrinsic part of that aesthetics. So it's not surprising then that Kashmir has long been presented as a garden within creative production from the region and also analysis of imaginative representations of that production. I'm thinking of Subir Kaul's recent book, Gardens and Graves, for example. So specific descriptive components of this garden circulate within an imaginary of Kashmir as what I have called a territory of desire. What I meant by that in my book of the same name was basically that there was a certain discursive construction of Kashmir, and that proceeded through intersubjective investments in a complex fantasy. But for me, that fantasy, however, again, whatever antecedents may have been in Mughal art and aesthetics, the fantasy clicked into place with the entry of the camera into the Valley of Kashmir from the late 19th century, because that meant the technology of mechanical reproduction could keep magnetically, just kind of augmenting and circulating those images in a particular way, fixing and circulating these images. And so from the late 19th century then, this predominantly visualized fantasy of desirability accrued many different dimensions: natural beauty, civilizational antiquity, erasure of Kashmiris from the land, and of course, attempts by diverse parties to reoccupy that evacuated land symbolically and materially. And cross-cutting this layered structure of desire are successive interventions from post-colonial India as an occupying and neo-colonizing force. The most recent phase of which, of course, as we know, commenced on August 5th, 2019. With the reduction of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory, diminished territorially and in terms of federative autonomy through the abrogation of its constitutionally enshrined special status. And all these developments, against all these developments, I would like to place this persistent allegory of the Kashmir Valley as a garden by different kinds of people interested in representing Kashmir. And this horticultural imagery, which we saw manifested even in, that's the legacy that Mahjoor uses in this manifesto-like poem, come bird, it is only you. First of all, the bird is waiting for a gardener. So that's kind of like, it starts off in a kind of, almost like a kind of very expected way, and then something else happens. And the bird is being directed by the poet to forge with your own hands the instruments of your own deliverance, your own freedom, which is very powerful. So what Mahjoor does is he plays with a certain legacy, which could be called a pastoral way of representing Kashmir, because the pastoral is a classical Western genre, which has a particular dialogue going on between the forest, going out of the urban space and the urban space. But we can use pastoral, and I have myself used pastoral. Agha Shahid Ali uses the word pastoral in a very famous poem, which plays again with the same garden images, the birds. Maybe we can talk about that poem later. So a lot of people would recognize the similarities between this whole bank of horticultural images circulating in Kashmir and the idea of the pastoral, but there is something very specific in the Kashmiri images, which is basically its Persianate legacy, as I said a moment earlier. So the Kashmir Valley in various folk songs, poems, and visualizations from Kashmir is evoked as a garden. not just like a wilderness or a place for sheep and shepherds to go off to in a Christian classical way. It's a garden. It's a very beautiful and aesthetically organized garden. And in a way, there is a cognate with biblical and medieval Latin traditions, which would call this garden the hortus conclusus, which means the enclosed garden. But the Indo-Persian tradition would call it the gulshan. It's just a place for flowers, for roses, ornamental garden of very delicately colored, perfumed roses, which are ephemeral. So it's also a bit of the carpe diem trope that pluck the flower, as the carpe diem tradition would say. Again, it's a classical Western classical tradition. Pluck the flower because it will wither, and so grab your opportunity today. Don't wait for tomorrow. What happens in the Gulshan tradition, and especially in the Kashmiri version, is that it's not just the flower that's very important in this imagination, but the bulbul, the nightingale, is also quite important. So there's a whole, but then Kashmiri poetry also adds a whole lot of other birds. There are birds of prey, like the eagle, the hawk, baz, baz in the Kashmiri pronunciation. And so all these avian actors, they enter the garden and do all kinds of interesting things. And Asya, you actually have a poem that also answers to that, don't you? I am a bird of a yet to be born garden. I mean, of course, you are taking Ghalib there, but you create your own poem from there. Now I'm not an artist, for art seeks leisure. My need is immediate. I'm trying to steal your shadow, running against time, trying to hold water in a wicker basket as we once did. I'm trying to save your myths in my palms, but my hands are too small. I'm afraid myths might slip or hands may leak. I'm racing with whales before they fly away like birds, without reaching half-deaf ears. I tried to safeguard your ghazals, sun-dried with chili peppers for winter, wrapped in obituaries of poets who died too young. So many references there. We can recognize all of them. I'm forcing memory to resurrect lines buried in dusty newspapers and gloomy archive centers. I so wish one day I will free those lines, create my own lyrics, leave no scope for a pale orchestra playing the Shalimar, concert goers hedged by concertina wire. So it might seem very interesting that we've just talked about Asya's preoccupation with slowing down time through stage, but in this poem, you are like almost running against time. So clearly, this battle with time is not just a matter of one, like, either you slow down and that's the end of the, you found your answer to the problem, or you speed up and you found another answer. Agha Shahid Ali, for example, is doing both in the poem Pastoral, because in that poem, he's saying, we will meet someday in Srinagar. So that's a futurity. And you don't know when that's going to happen. All the tenses are mixed up anyway. It doesn't make any sense except for poetically. And then running through the lines, there is a bird that keeps saying, quick, it's time, come, come. And this bird is very urgent, the cry of the bird. So, I think it's perfectly logical to both think that slow time and extra fast time, speeded up time, are both somehow to be caught, and something has to be done with both these temporalities to make time your own again. And that's really what I find very important in the poems you've written for us and the film you've done, because both give us this composite picture. So why am I calling this garden now, as I've done in the title of my talk, if you use the Latin term hortus conclusus, I created a little pun, and I called it hortus interruptus, the interrupted garden, because of course the garden in springtime has its own temporality, i.e. if you're waiting for spring to come, and the coming of the bird will allegorically open up the body to sexuality, because the bird is going to light on the flower, and we know what all that means, right? So the whole idea is that springtime is the time also for the waiting to be over in times of your sexuality to be fulfilled. And this is the whole allegorical dimension of the temporality of this garden. But the point, I think, which comes out in a lot of, especially in the film Heather, which I've analyzed quite closely from this angle, is that the problem with conflict and conflict zone is that nothing is normal, and no fulfillment happens in the way it happens everywhere else. And so it is an interrupted time. So the garden's business is interrupted. And of course, I am alluding to, to the phrase used in medical terms of coitus interruptus. So the sexuality itself is interrupted. But this is what I mean to say is that in this imagining of what happens in a conflict zone and how you communicate it through using temporality and pleasure and desire and its interruption, it's almost like the only thing you can think about is heteronormative sex. And if it is interrupted, then there's a problem, and if it's not, wonderful. What happens in the film Heather is that all these signifiers get so complicated that the only way to deal with it is that everybody dies. I mean, the women all are finished. One drowns, the other detonates a suicide bomb. This is very, in Achille Mbembe's term, necropolitical. For Achille Mbembe also, necropolitics is what happens when the body, you are so oppressed that the only way you can resist is by taking your own life. And the suicide bomber is the classic trope for Mbembe's necropolitical, imaginary. And I'm like, this is also the case in Haider. I'm like, surely there must be a better way to talk about resistance than, detonating a bomb on yourself. What about Allegro Politics? So that's the term I have coined in dialogue with Mbembe's necropolitics. And Allegro Politics always makes me look for signifiers of a collective joy, resolved also through your individual satisfaction, a sort of a joining up of fragmented pieces in a way that the individual fits smoothly into the community and doesn't only need to think about self-fulfillment in the terms of, I hope I have a sexual fulfillment through in a heteronormative relationship. There must be more ways to saying I'm a joyful human being. And I really find that spectrum, Allegro political spectrum, coming to the fore in Asia's poetry. Shakur Rather's very interesting and beautiful novel, Life in the Clock Tower Valley, I think is also trying to do something similar. For example, I really love the chapter where he talks about bakeries in Kashmir, where people congregate to have special kind of Kashmiri bread at different times of the day. In the morning, you have one kind of bread. In the afternoon, you go for another. And it's also a place for people to congregate, to talk and find out what's happening. There's also a love story evolving between the young man and the young woman. And so the valley, the Clock Tower Valley, it has got the clock, but it's also got these other temporalities, which means different people are looking for different things, but they're also kind of converging and interweaving. And that spectrum of trying to have a satisfying, happy, joyful life on different levels is definitely there in Asia's poetry. However, what I find is most important and feminist is this insistence that it is also me that's important, just for myself, and I really enjoy the poetry because of that. Now, I know that I should be wrapping up. How much time do I have?
You have another 10.
Yeah, so let me come to parts that I think we can go to. Well, now, where is, so I think, for example, it would be this is what happens when you have all your papers everywhere and you think you've annotated them very carefully. I'm still trying to look for where my point number 9 is. I think I got it. What happens, as I said, which is quite an interesting counterpoint to Heather, is that, what Heather does as a film, which I think is important, is that it spells out a little bit the problems around waiting, because this idea of the garden, where things will happen in time, is also one of pleasurable waiting. And under normal circumstances, the film seems to suggest this is okay, but problem is that we are in Kashmir. And therefore, the film almost works into itself the necessity of interruption. We need to interrupt matters because otherwise this waiting will never end. And this interruption is given to us through the very difficult and problematic sexuality of the mother, this is of course going back to the figure of Hamlet, I mean the whole Oedipal triangle in Hamlet. The problem is that Hyder is not happy that he sees his mother rediscovering her sexuality, and that too with his uncle. So this is definitely no-go territory, and it is the cause of everything unraveling, to go back to that red muffler, because it also has repercussions on his own relationship with Arshia, the young girl who was knitting the red muffler. What the film does do, though, even though, as I said, it sort of dispenses everybody, I mean, everyone, it's a tragedy, it's Hamlet, after all, in Bollywood, guys, and so everyone has to have a sticky end. It leaves you, though, with images, because that's what films do. It leaves you images and moments that you cannot forget. And one of them is the fact that whenever Ghazala, his mother, is with her maybe lover, maybe beloved, I mean, with the man she's attracted to, she laughs, you know, she has laughter on her lips, and they are singing and dancing. They're singing to Kashmiri folk song, and I think it's quite important that those two lines of the Kashmiri folk song are coming to us through Bollywood in the Kashmiri language. So we hear, so there's a whole concatenation of, there are certain local resources, be it the river, the trees. There's an image of the two lovers embracing inside a chinar tree, which is also very powerful, or the folk song. These are all proxonus means to become, to gain your own autonomy again through pleasure and happiness, and the woman's laughter becomes again a sound and an image that, even though she is finished off by the film by making, you know, she detonates her suicide bomb and she dies, but we cannot forget that laughter. And I think that lyric, you know, those lyric punctuations of the narrative is exactly what come back to us every time we read a poem, which is giving us maybe a slightly different mood, but it's giving us those moments of me and myself, you know, even if sometimes these are dystopian dreams, as you say, that's the last line of the last poem of your anthology. So this is it's a very, it's quite an angry poem. I will burn my books. Mephistopheles, I yell into my phone. Mephistopheles, I go to his voicemail. Mephistopheles, I will burn my books. I cough and sneeze at night, plastic mandarin teeth, Chanel shades, and a contact lens nestled inside my eye, all fall down as I cuss. Oh God, even contact lenses face a point of view backlash. My sari loosens at the waist. I eat salmon sushi for brunch, thinking of my babies never born. I'm at the mercy of history. I've lost a bit of my memory. I curse the moment I let you go. There was enough time, 40 nights between the calf and Moses at Mount Sinai. Yet, I crafted your absence beyond the cracked dome. Is the solitude singularly dark? Isn't God lonely too in her abode with no other gods to keep company? Down here in a decayed mosque, at the mercy of a sunken-eyed muezzin, I slug it out with ghosts of time who exhaust me to death. I dream the same dreams over and over again. Like Moses, I too throw a staff. No God appears from a burning bush, no sea parts. The rod only puts in a cameo. In the vacuity of my tale, I am a torn off page from one of my burnt books, faded ink of a promised land, a dystopian dream, they say. So this is the last poem in the anthology, and it sounds really angry, but it's also very, I love the different voices you have, Asya, in your poems, because they're also very practical and very daily, because about contact lenses, you know, about another poem, sipping cold coffee in Cafe Turtle in Khan Market. You know, you do things on an everyday basis, and then suddenly something hits you, like something goes through your brain, like a lightning bolt, and you're angry, you know, and you're like, but what about me? And I think that even though I am a torn off page, you're still a page, and this is the page on which you've left your mark. So there is a way in which the Allegro Politics that I'm talking about of trying to find time for yourself may take on a veneer of anger and negativity, but the very fact that it can do it is a satisfaction. And that itself is a kind of joy or alegria. So for me, even a very, I think, daring film like Heather can only go a certain way, in a certain direction and no more, because it is a bit trapped in, again, this heteronormative circuit. And even a very beautiful and satisfying, novel like this one, which I really loved, Life in the Clock Tower Valley, is also ultimately, the story is still about a boy and girl. And, I'm not saying that that's not important. I'm just saying that we all know how heteronormativity and patriarchy and those institutions all sit together, and ultimately we don't seem to have a way out. And so I feel the true source of Allegro Politics, from a feminist point of view, from a woman's point of view, is actually the woman herself. And an anthology is like this, is about there are options of different kinds that the poems release, but all the options go back to what the film Stitch also shows us, the girl, and how she will deal with what is around her. And learning how to deal with it is really what is the lesson of growing up and learning to control time and overcome and reoccupy time in a conflict zone. So I think what I see Asia's work doing is taking, carving out of that box of heteronormativity, a program of self-love and self-care, and it complements, I think, various other efforts coming out of Kashmir today, some of which are collaborative with institutions, as I said, of popular culture, Indian popular culture, such as Bollywood and others are doing, because even ultimately when you write a novel and publish it from a publishing house in India, you are also doing another kind of collaboration there. So all these efforts are ultimately, they are using whatever is out there to do whatever you can. What all of them do, one way or the other, is give us some important glimpses into a Kashmiri habitus, which is defined by a sensorium that opens up a world alternative to these very stubborn Kashmir cliches that have clung on to our imaginations through Bollywood. And these sensorial alternatives include, for example, explaining to us that there's something like winter in Kashmir, like Heather shows you, this wintertime landscape is very important to feel that cold, that grayness, and the beauty of that, along with the green valleys and, the springtime scene. It also takes us into this, as I said, this collective imaginary where waiting for spring has been commemorated in these garden horticultural images. It reminds us that time and again, poets from within Kashmir have taken those images and done other things with them, like the Majur song. And Asia is, of course, just in that tradition, doing yet another layer of her things with that tradition. And so in the fragments of Asia's lyric consciousness, I think these kinds of flashes come together to move Allegro Politics, which is my term for thinking about the politics of collective joy experienced through the individual in the collective. So these flashes come together to move Allegro Politics beyond the trap of privileging heteronormative romance, however transgressive that romance may be, as the cornerstone for rebuilding community. It is, after all, as Majur says, forge with your own hands the tools of your own deliverance. So we have to move beyond the couple to the individual and then reintegrate back through these various steps and configurations. Why not? But it has to start with individual. So despite its insomnia and its tiredness, the almond tree of Asia's poem reminds us that starting from its very conception as a poem by a Kashmiri woman, there can indeed be a time for Allegro Politics in Kashmir. Thank you.
We can